Hello, everybody. Welcome to this month's OPSWAT Academy webinar. I'm Nate Medeiros, Product Manager of OPSWAT Academy, and today we have something a little different for you. Typically, we have guests come on the webinar and we ask them questions. We have an interview with them and talk about lots of subjects within the critical infrastructure protection industry, whether that's compliance related or technology related. Today, we're going to be going over a lesson uh, about the evolving perimeter within cybersecurity. This is a subject that we touched upon a little bit in the remote work webinar, how the landscape has changed since the global pandemic. We have a lot more people working from home and the cybersecurity challenges that arise from that. Today, we're going to be looking at the technologies that we can incorporate to facilitate a more secure environment in the modern age of how we deal with our applications. So to go through this, I'm going to be going through a whiteboard session with you all, and we're going to be going over these concepts relating to the expanding perimeter in cybersecurity and just our workforce in general. So on the left-hand side of this screen, we have a diagram crudely representing a traditional network perimeter. Just to clarify what we mean by that, where our central server is located somewhere within the network, within the building, and our devices are connecting into those resources while at the same time being encompassed by some defined network. Then, if these devices need to go out and access the internet externally, let's use this cloud as an internet access for now, they have to go out through this network perimeter, this circle, and into whatever resource they're trying to access. But today, we don't see a lot of companies that are still using this closed network system because so many applications that we use today are SaaS providers, software as a service. Think of Office 365, all the SharePoint applications that you can access the cloud from there, your email applications. Think of Dropbox, even your chat software like Teams or Slack. Those are cloud infrastructures hosted by vendors that exist in the cloud that your devices access. So now we have more of these cloud resources opposed to this traditional network resource where everything was hosted internally, managed by the internal IT team. Now we have vendors that we have subscriptions to, software as a service, and we utilize those in the cloud. Now, this poses a lot of security challenges as it is, because now we have less control from the security aspect. We don't have this nice intersection here where we can secure inbound and outbound flow coming from and to and from these software applications when we don't have this traditional network perimeter. Now, what we see is devices that can be anywhere, even within networks or from work from home environments that are accessing these software applications. So let's use our first term here to help define some of these subjects and some of these concepts. What we're talking about here is a service provider. This is what we're talking about when mentioning things like Office 365, Slack, Teams, and Salesforce, other CRM solutions, things like that. So we're going to be calling those kind of software as a service applications service providers. All right, just to get the picture here. Now, this device on the bottom, this more represents what it looks like today, where a device can be anywhere. It's not within a defined secure network. This device can be in an office, at a home. The direct access to the service provider is where a lot of cybersecurity challenges can arise. Now, there's going to be an important concept that we're going to be talking about today with identity versus security. And a lot of these service providers have methods to handle identity. This does not include some of the things that we might care about, though, from a cybersecurity perspective. So let's jump into that and explain why this moving away from this perimeter bottleneck or single point of entry exposes us to some of these risks. So I'm going to change this diagram around a little bit. Let's get rid of some of these items. All right, let's move this laptop over. So this is a laptop that wants to access this service provider. Let's say Salesforce. Now we know that accessing this service as software as a service, this user will need to authenticate in order to provide their credentials to access the resources that they're assigned to. That's handled very well today through multiple mechanisms, some of which we'll dive into a little bit later in this lesson. Now, the issue with this is that there's a lot of elements about this device that we don't know about that we care about from a cybersecurity perspective. Things like the local password policy. Now, different from the credentials to access the service provider, if this is a laptop, a portable device, the local password to access that laptop may be very weak or may not have one at all, depending on what the user of that laptop sets it to and the security policies that are enforced within the organization. If this is a personal device with a BYOD culture within a company, a bring your own device, then those users that own that device have full control over those local password policies in most cases. So we need to know, is the password to access this device, which is accessing our protected services like Salesforce or Office 365, is that protected? But the typical access method to get to these service providers doesn't have any way to know that. Similarly, goes along the lines of the device getting stolen in some fashion, like the local password being weak. Do we know if the hard drive is encrypted? This is important because even if the thief who stole the device isn't able to get into the device with the password because perhaps the local password is relatively strong, they may be able to extract the hard drive, and if those files are not encrypted, they can potentially pull out sensitive or proprietary information from that device directly just by pulling files from the hard drive. And once again, the user logging into Salesforce, there's no way to really know or check that. Finally, if we have uh, malware installed on the device, and even if the local antivirus is screaming about it, you have a keylogger tracking the keys, tracking your passwords, you have a screenshot malware or recording malware that's getting information from your screen and sending that somewhere. Even if that is being detected by the local AV, there's no connection between that local antivirus that's installed on this device and accessing our cloud resources. So we need to know if the local AV has detected any threats and make a decision on whether or not this device should or should not access our cloud resources. In most companies now, to iterate on the point, a lot of sensitive, critical, and proprietary information exists on these CRM, software as a service vendors that we trust that data to. But if we can't ensure the endpoints that we're using as employees are secure, then that puts all of it at risk. So the local AV records and the local AV activity, things like the firewall as well, kind of combining into that last point, are those security elements available on the device? Now, we can go a little bit further as well. The entry point for malware, the entry point for hackers to be able to affect your device is often done through vulnerabilities on the system. Am I running out of date applications? Those out of date applications can have software vulnerabilities. The longer they go unchecked, the more development time hackers have had to perfect their craft in exploiting that particular vulnerability, and the more likely it is that a device can get a rootkit installed, which can ultimately mask other malware installed on the device as well. Very bad situation. So, are applications up to date? And by applications, we're talking about Java runtime environments, which is a prerequisite for a lot of applications, or your browsers, your browser extensions, things like that. And along the same lines as well, vulnerabilities can exist within the OS system. So we need to make sure that the operating system is patched and ready to go with the latest updates so that they're not vulnerable to exploits that have been recently discovered. Let's decrease the size of this a little bit to make some space. So now that we've identified some of these concerns or considerations of devices accessing our service provider, you can start to see where the challenges arise with a enterprise solution, enterprise work environment that most of us live in today that deal with all of these SaaS applications with the inability to lock down those elements that we're looking for security. And it was easier back when all of these devices were within a single location, within a single network. We could install more security tools, enforce more security policies with Active Directory and other enforcement possibilities that would allow us to ensure that things like this, these devices have their firewalls turned on, that they have local AV reporting, things like that. But with BYOD devices, or even just devices in home networks that are accessing these SaaS applications, we have less control now. And the identity aspect of this is handled, like I said, very well. But the security aspect, as it stands, doesn't exist on its own with the way that we access these critical applications. And even in environments in critical infrastructure, which we focus on heavily here at OPSWAT, where you do have those isolated networks and isolated environments, almost always these companies have to have some kind of enterprise IT infrastructure that surrounds the lower level OT or lower level closed network segmented networks that do the actual processing. So there needs to be a CRM solution to help with the business side of things. There needs to be an email solution to allow for communication. There needs to be a file sharing solution so that plans, diagrams, builds can be distributed within the company. So even where those network segmentation pieces exist, there's very few situations and very few companies where we truly have very limited SaaS applications that are relevant to day-to-day operations in modern networks. So this is a very common issue that doesn't have a extremely straightforward solution on how we can ensure that all of these devices that are accessing our sensitive applications are secure. And we're going to look at some ways that we can enforce this and can ensure that our cloud applications are protected. Okay, so let's move this off to the side and let's talk about identity and security. So I've already mentioned a few times about how service providers handle identity very well. But it's important to understand that identity and security are not necessarily the same thing. They're very closely related, but identity management is just a piece of an overall cybersecurity framework. When I access an a service provider, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here. When I access a service provider, I need to provide credentials to that service provider to validate myself and have that system know that I am who I say I am. And typically, This is done through several enterprise solutions that allow us to identify who we are with multiple applications at once. And we call that an identity provider solution or an IDP. Let's put a circle around this guy. Now, why do we use IDPs? Identity providers. Think of Centrify, Okta, things like that. Well, here's the problem that was solved by using identity providers for SaaS applications. If there is a service provider, such as Salesforce, then what's going to happen is that this service provider is going to have a database of all of the users that are accessing their application in this tenant. This are things like roles, groups, anything that's relevant to that user for operating within that system. Now, what ended up happening when software as a service started taking off is that there was so many different databases that were currently in use at any time. So whenever a device was going to access a service provider, it would have to provide its credentials, and then it would, if you had to access another one in the same day, you'd have to provide those credentials, a different set of credentials, hopefully, to the additional service provider. And finally, if you had a third application you were using, which was very common, typically we don't operate out of just one SaaS application per day, you'd have to authenticate with that one separately as well. And there's lots of issues with this, just from a IT management standpoint. If there's somebody leaves the company, now we have multiple different vendors and services that we need to go through and make sure that that database is cleared and that user set is um, no longer in there, so they don't have access to those resources. And having to go through and manage all of them separately, obviously, is an issue when you're dealing with multiple management solutions. Additionally, a lot of people don't use different credentials when they're accessing uh, multiple applications per day. If there's a user, they have 5 different SaaS applications they have to access, and they just want to do their job. A lot of people will tend to use the same username password combination for all of those different applications. And what ends up happening is now the attack surface area for that user's credentials has greatly increased, because if any of the applications that you're using gets compromised in some way, if there's a breach of some kind, and that data gets extracted by a hacker, then oftentimes when credentials are discovered, they're they're used to try to log into a myriad of other solutions, because the hackers know that people tend to use the same credentials for multiple different solutions. So the more databases in which your credentials are stored separately, the higher that risk becomes. So that's why the IDP solution took off, to be able to manage a lot of these issues. So let's put a couple more of these service provider elements here without the database. We'll just use 2 for now. So now, instead of the user connecting directly to a service provider, now to authenticate, they go through an IDP, identity provider. Once again, think of Okta, Centrify. And that IDP will in turn authenticate with the service provider. And therefore, the authentication only happens in one place. And you can use things as a single source of truth. A lot of companies use Active Directory for their single source of truth for their user database. And the IDP is capable of authenticating with this database before it goes to any of these other solutions. So the user will access the IDP interface. It'll have a list of applications they can access. They'll pick one of them, say this one on the top is Salesforce. The IDP will check against the Active Directory credentials, validate that that user is indeed who they say they are coming from this device. So the authentication happens here in this closed loop within this element here. So the first authentication happens here. Once the IDP agrees that this user exists and they are who they say they are, then it authenticates with the service provider. And this is done through a few different ways. The one we're going to talk about today is called SAML. It stands for Security Assertion Markup Language. And we've been using SAML 2.0 since 2005. It's been around for a little while. And SAML 2.0 operates by a trust between the identity provider and the service provider. And what this trust is, it's through a certificate share. I'm not going to get too far into the exact process. There's handshakes that happen back and forth when the user is going through the IDP versus the service provider, and when that authentication is requested. But just the important thing to note is that instead of sending credentials to the service provider, they send a token. Capitalize that. And this token is used to give the information about this user, which is defined either at the IDP level. Sometimes the single source of truth exists here within the IDP, and you're not connected to any other external user database. But you can do things like a sync with Active Directory, in which case you have your groups, you have your assignments, and all of that information can be included in the token to then be provided to the service provider like Salesforce to define the role of the user and authenticate them to that service provider. So this token is sent and through a certificate share, validated that it's coming from this trusted source, the IDP, and the user can log in and access the service provider. Now, from a alternative approach, let's get rid of this guy. The user could instead head toward the service provider first. So instead of going to the SSO interface first, they could instead go to the service provider interface first, in which case there's usually some kind of prompt asking, it could be a button that says sign in with SSO. You may have seen something like that. Or asking just for the email first before asking for the email password combination, because then the service provider, with its pre-configured integration with an IDP, will know this is a SAML integration. So now I'm going to go back to the IDP and the whole authentication process starts again. IDP validates that the user exists, that they are who they say they are, and then sends the token back to the service provider for the user to log in. Now this top diagram here, let's get there's a token on this level as well. Let's go ahead and just add one here. And I need my token here as well. That's the response. Now this top process, when the user is going to the IDP interface, clicking on the application, this is referred to as an IDP initiated SSO, identity provider initiated single sign-on. I go to the identity provider first, I click on the application I want to access, and therefore I am accessing Salesforce. The bottom one shows SP initiated SSO, stands for service provider initiated SSO. I'm going to the service provider first The service provider is responsible for having some mechanism of identifying the user as an SSO user, and then it accesses that particular IDP tenant, in which case the user is authenticated back to the service provider for access. So, what this does is it gives a single point of control for companies to manage cloud access for all of their users. Now, why is this important? And how does this impact those elements that we're listing on the bottom of the screen here with the local password, encryption, antivirus, firewall, applications, up to date OS patches? Well, this gives us an avenue. This gives us an avenue as an intermediary between the actual device itself and the service, the SaaS application, the service provider that we are attempting to access. So we have a solution at OPSWAT called Meta Access, and I wanted to give this graph here before showing this diagram. This diagram shows a very high level overview of devices accessing applications on the right hand side through OPSWAT Meta Access. And here you can see it's protecting things like Salesforce, Box, Office 365. We're grouping those into the cloud SaaS applications. Also, things that you have locally installed. It could be even if in your own cloud infrastructure like VMware data centers, things like that. And also external internet access. We're not going to focus on the external internet access here, nor are we going to focus on the NAC part of this center diagram. What we're going to be talking about today is the SDP and cloud access. And that's because what NAC is best suited for is protecting those local environments. But the topic of today's lesson is how do we protect these external, these cloud, these SaaS applications? And that's where cloud access and SDP come into place. So we haven't touched on SDP yet, but we will get there later on in this lesson. So when we're looking at this diagram, you can see that the devices on the left need to access resources on the right. And somehow, in some way, Meta Access sits in the middle and protects those devices. And that is why I prefaced all of this with the identity management with SAML. Nothing that you're seeing here is OPSWAT related, is an OPSWAT solution. This is a existing identification mechanism that has been around since 2005 that we're using to lower the burden of management and increase the security of those credentials for users to have that single source of truth, that single place where we can put our security policies for password length, rotation, complexity, things like that. It's always easier to have that in a single place, and we can lower that attack surface area by having it controlled by this identity provider. Now that you understand what SAML 2.0 is, and you've seen the diagram of Meta Access, the simple diagram, we can start piecing together on how this is actually implemented. So that diagram didn't really show a lot about what Meta Access is doing. Meta Access itself is a client-based solution in which this device is getting checked for everything that we've listed here that we are concerned about from a cybersecurity perspective. So you can think of Meta Access as a tool that runs on this solution, on this laptop, that is checking for these different elements. It does a lot. There's a lot more that I can do when it comes to the security of your device, but let's use these 6 different points as our baseline for things that we care about of devices accessing our sensitive service providers, SaaS applications. So we want to know, are all of these things okay with this device before they access those applications? Meta Access does that by having a client that's running on this device and by having mechanisms in which we can use to enforce this. So we're having the OPSWAT client run on this device. Put that OPSWAT client logo there in the device to clarify that that exists. So what can we do with this client? And what can we do with meta access? Well, let's expand this a bit. I need to clean up some of these lines. So let's get rid of this token. And we'll go ahead and move this later. So what can we do with this IDP? We're going to move this IDP over, give us a little more space. We understand that this is SAML. I'll keep this here. And let's move this IDP out. And we'll move this Active Directory over here as well. So because SAML has that token certificate relationship with the IDP, let's talk about that a little bit more before we move on to meta access to understand how this integration works. Let's get rid of these lines as well. So if we have an IDP, the way we set up the trust here is we set up the service provider with a certificate relationship with the IDP. Now, what does that mean? It means that when we set up our application, we set it up within the identity provider solution, and we set it up within the service provider solution. So we know from our configurations that these different endpoints, these different tenants, will be validated by the certificate relationship between the IDP and the service provider. That is why we're able to send the token instead of the username and password. That token that is sent from the IDP does not contain any password information. So that token needs to be validated through other means. Like we mentioned before, it's from the certificate validation. So it's configured on the service provider and it's configured on the IDP. So the service provider, like Office 365 and Salesforce, it needs to support SAML 2.0 in order for all of this to work in the first place. Most SaaS applications do support federated services through SSO, through SAML. So this is a pretty common ability for most SaaS applications to facilitate. And this allows us to then use this process to include some security mechanisms. Because what if instead of validating this certificate, we'll call this certificate 1. What if instead of validating certificate 1, we instead have a intermediary solution? And let's do rounded sides. Let's give this a little bit bigger. All right. We instead have an intermediary solution that we can use to validate security elements of a device. Move this up here a little bit. Now, what does that mean? Well, just from this diagram here, we can say that this device accesses the IDP, and we know that the IDP validates against Active Directory to validate the user, and then once that's done, it then goes to the service provider with a token that does not include password information. And with this token, the user is accessing these things. And that's done because there's a certificate relationship. This one we're labeling 1 with this other certificate that's the same relationship here. Well, what if instead we have the IDP first forward to meta access and then forward to the service provider? Now what this does, let's get rid of this. Is we can have a new certificate relationship. And this certificate relationship now changes the overall process. Instead of having a one-to-one, the first certificate relationship is between the IDP and meta access. And now we have another certificate relationship between meta access and the service provider. Took a little bit to draw that out, but now you can see this changes the process. So now no longer can I access straight from the IDP to the service provider if I wanted to. I have to use the meta access intermediary in order to have this relationship trust for my tokens to be properly validated. Because if I tried to send a SAML assertion directly from the IDP to the service provider now, what's going to happen is that the certificate relationship is no longer going to be valid because it's a different relationship now. It has to be matched. Now, by having this intermediary here, what we can then do is use meta access to do things that typical identification doesn't do in normal circumstances. Now, what do we mean by that? And let's go ahead and let's get rid of this Active Directory element here simply because we can imply that the IDP is managing the identity. We're focusing on this element now. So let's just get rid of that for now. So what does this mean? This means that now this meta access solution sitting in between this SAML authentication process can now check the client to see if all of these elements are compliant with our policies before giving the green light for the second action to happen. So what's going to happen, let's say we have a compliant device and the compliance check comes back good. The device can access the service that it's intending to do. So let's walk through this. The device, let me make a icon here so we can follow this. We'll do a red circle so we can all see. The device wants to access Salesforce. So what's that process going to look like? Salesforce being the service provider over here. Let's do an IDP initiated SSO example where I'm going to my Okta console. We use Okta as an example for this. And I am seeing my list of applications that I have access to. I don't know anything about this meta access integration here. All I see is that I can access a list of applications, and one of those that I want to access is Salesforce. So I click on accessing Salesforce. What's going to happen when this is set up properly from the IT team with this integration is this is first going to get this request to access Salesforce is first going to get forwarded to meta access, which is validated by the IDP having that authentication already with Active Directory. We removed it, but let's remember that it's implied here that the user is validated through with whatever source of truth database exists. The user is already validated. Now, instead of sending directly to Salesforce, I'm going to first, the IDP is configured to instead go to Meta Access. Then what Meta Access does is it says, okay, I got a new request for an access to this particular endpoint, this Salesforce tenant. Let's see what the compliance status of the device is. It's going to check whatever data was provided by the client, which is checking these elements that we care about, and check against that report card from what these elements are, and then decide this device is compliant or non-compliant based on my policies for uh, for this particular uh, application or this particular group of devices. It's going to check to see if it's compliant, and if it is, then it will forward the the access of the device to the service provider with mirroring what previously existed before the meta access integration. So this step from the number 2 certificate share is replicating what existed from the IDP to the service provider. So once again, IDP initiated SSO process, user accesses the IDP, it gets forwarded to Meta Access. Meta Access checks against the state of the device compared to the policies, gives it a yes or no, and then it will forward to the service provider. Now, what happens if the device is not compliant? And we say that instead of a check mark here, we'll give this a non-compliant rating. Well, what Meta Access can do is instead forward them to a remediation page saying, hey, instead of going to the service provider, I'm going to instead point you to a page. We'll do a triangle representing the page. And this page is going to tell the user, hey, your device is not okay. And what this remediation page can do is tell the user exactly what's wrong. It can tell them your device is not encrypted or your firewall is off. And this allows users to, more often than not, fix their own problems. So not only are we increasing security by protecting these sensitive SaaS applications, but we're also allowing the users to fix their own issues and reduce that burden on IT when it comes to being able to facilitate fixing these security flaws within these devices. And this is done by having guides and knowledge bases that are defining what these are. So with this, we can then incorporate all of our applications this way. And our SaaS applications that existed with the SAML process can now have these relationships that are set up. And we'll do another one here. We'll call this 3. We can have all of our applications set up with this certificate relationship, and everything goes through Meta Access. And this is also true if the service provider is the SP initiated SSO, where if the device first tries to access the service provider first, let's actually do that. We'll do this, we'll bend the arrow. If the device tries to access the service provider first, then it's going to follow the traditional service provider SSO process, in which case it accesses the IDP first, and then all of the other process is occurring, and the user is either provided or not provided access, depending on what the state of the device is. So this is the SAML 2.0 cloud security process. Now, there is another process that we can look at, which we call SDP, which is a little bit more on the nose with the terminology that we're using here with the expanding network perimeter. SDP stands for software defined perimeter. And this works with a different process and a different technology. but ultimately it accomplishes a lot of the same things. It depends on what the application you're integrating with and what your current IT infrastructure is. That's going to determine what the best use case and the best solution is for protecting your assets. But the fundamental goal is going to be the same with SDP. So let's clear this diagram. Oh, let's get rid of this. Clean this up a little bit. Okay, so starting from a blank slate, we're going to talk about software-defined perimeter. SDP, software-defined perimeter. Now, software-defined perimeter works a different way than SAML. It doesn't rely on SAML 2.0. It doesn't rely on identity providers to protect an application. Now, we're going to show two different things that we can protect here. We're going to bring back our internal network. All right, and we're going to put a security perimeter around this. Okay, traditional network. And let's also add back a cloud application. And we'll use the same terminology here. Service provider. Now, with SDP, instead of going through an identity provider, we're going to be dealing with technology that OPSWAT provides that allows for connection to these elements. The most important thing to note when we're talking about SDP is that the destination that we're connecting to has to have the ability for the administrator or the owners of those applications to limit IP connections to that particular resource, whether that's internal or that's cloud. So let's pull up some of these elements here. What is important here? So there's two major elements with SDP, both of which are hosted by OPSWAT. The first one we'll look at is the broker. We're calling this SDP Trust Broker. And the other element is the SDP Gateway. And we're going to put this actually right here, and we'll explain why in a moment. So the SDP Gateway is a virtualized instance that's responsible for directing traffic to its destination resource. And this is going to be either to the service provider or to the internal network. The SDP gateway can be deployed in the cloud. OPSWAT offers a universal gateway that our customers can utilize, but oftentimes customers like to deploy their own gateway where they can install it in their own infrastructure and put it behind a firewall, even though SDP gateway works like a firewall in itself. Just know that this is it's a specialized instance in which all of the connections come from this origin point. And this gateway is what we're going to define when allowing access to applications or services or destinations within or outside of our network. So the IP address of the SDP gateway is what's going to be used to darken all of the elements here. Now, what's different from this from a traditional VPN solution? We haven't talked about the trust broker yet, but you'll see why in a minute. What's different from a traditional VPN solution? VPN solutions will have the user connect to the client first, or connect to the server first from the client, and then validate and identify second. And this leaves security concerns, especially with things like DDoS attacks, where connection requests can happen so frequently that it can take a system down. And what happens with this trust broker gateway combo is that this introduces a identify first and then connect second approach. So this device is first going to authenticate with the trust broker, and the trust broker will then identify if the user is who they say they are. And this is done today often through meta access, which can be connected to an identity resource. This can also be an IDP like we talked to before, but can also be something like an Active Directory directly. So we'll go ahead and bring that back to bring back the visualization of this. Let's move this over here, actually. And I'm just going to shorthand Active Directory. So the device connects to the trust broker, and then it gets validated by some user database. And only then, once it's been validated, will it connect to the SDP gateway. This way, the gateway itself, the entry point for all of our protected applications, any traffic that's not coming from, that's validated by the trust broker is automatically dropped. So what we can do is we can visualize this by having let's say a external device here, our bad actor device, trying to access the SDP gateway. This is going to get immediately dropped because it is not validated by the trust broker. Similarly, if the bad actor tries to access the service provider directly, like we mentioned before, let's just put this here. These destination endpoints, so this is accessing the gateway, this is accessing the service provider. These destination endpoints are darkened because they're only allowed access per the configurations to receive input from the gateway directly. So this is validated as yes. This is validated as yes over here as well. So we'll make green check mark there. And another one here. We'll move that there. Now, what about accessing the trust broker? Well, this is something that the OPSWAT client also comes into place with, because not only are we also checking the validation of these elements here, we can also verify that only devices that are connecting from a device with the client itself can access the trust broker. Therefore, we can say that endpoints that are accessing our trust broker without the client are invalidated. Therefore, the traffic is dropped. And once again, we can say that this device that we have here that does have the client and does have the validation can access the trust broker. So there's elements that extend all of the compliance checking away from this gateway, away from the actual service provider, and away from the internal network resources. This gateway is not susceptible to DDoS attacks because first, the device has to be validated as having the client. And then after it's validated as having the client, only then is it connected to the gateway. So let's once again go through this Eclipse and go through the process. This device wants to access, let's say, an internal resource over here. So the process is going to be the client itself is installed, everything is validated as good to go from a compliance standpoint. The trust broker connection is initiated. Then from the trust broker, the device is connected to the gateway. A more accurate representation would be after this number two section happens here, the device is then authenticated and allowed to connect to the gateway, but we're going to just remove this from now, keep this high level. From there, the user can access the resource from the gateway. They go to the broker, they're validated, they have the client, they can get forwarded to the gateway, then they can access their resource that they're trying to get to. And this also provides a means to say, we're not even going to try to validate you as a user if you don't have the client installed. And we're not going to even try to connect you to the gateway if you haven't been validated on that second step. So that's going to wrap it up for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining this call. We hope you liked this more lesson-oriented format of a webinar. The end of the year is approaching. So here at OPSWAT Academy, we're wishing you a very happy new year, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.